In the summer of 1945, Joseph Stalin sat in the Kremlin reading intelligence reports about one American general. Not Eisenhower, not MacArthur. George Patton, the man who wanted to keep driving east, the man who called the Soviets the enemy we should be fighting. Stalin closed the folder and made a decision. 6 months later, Patton was dead. Coincidence? A former OSS agent named Douglas Bazata said no, and he should know. He claimed he was paid $10,000 to arrange the accident that killed Patton. But here is where the story gets strange. Bazata's confession came 34 years after Patton's death. And 5 years before that confession, a novel was published describing almost exactly the same assassination method. Did Bazata tell the truth? Did he copy a novel? Or did the novelist somehow know what really happened? This is not a simple story of murder. This is a story of questions that refuse to die, just like the memory of the general who asked too many questions himself. George Patton had always been a problem for the people who were supposed to be on his side. In Sicily, he slapped 2 soldiers suffering from combat fatigue and nearly lost his career. In France, he advanced so fast that his own commanders could not keep track of him. In Germany, he spoke his mind when everyone else was learning to speak carefully. But after the war ended, Patton became a different kind of problem. He refused to treat the Soviets as allies. He refused to pretend that the peace was real. At dinner parties and press conferences, he said things that made diplomats choke on their drinks. He compared denazification to letting the Democrats and Republicans fight over who gets to be in charge. He suggested that America should rearm the Germans and march east while the army was still mobilized. He called the Soviets savages and predicted they would control half of Europe within a decade. Washington told him to stop. He did not stop. Eisenhower warned him privately. Patton nodded politely and said something worse the next day. In October 1945, Eisenhower finally had enough. He relieved Patton of command of the Third Army, the legendary force that had carried Patton's name across Europe. Patton was reassigned to the 15th Army, a paper unit whose only real job was writing historical reports about the war. It was a humiliation designed to look like a promotion. Patton understood exactly what it was. He wrote to his wife Beatrice that his career was effectively over. He had become, in his own bitter words, a museum piece. But even in exile, Patton could not stay quiet. He continued giving interviews. He continued criticizing the occupation policy. He continued warning anyone who would listen that the Soviets were preparing for the next war while America was preparing to go home. His warnings were dismissed as the ravings of a warmonger who could not accept peace. History would prove many of his predictions correct, but in late 1945, Patton was just an embarrassment that needed to be managed. The Soviets certainly had reasons to want Patton silenced. Soviet intelligence had been tracking him since the final weeks of the war. They knew about his request to Eisenhower for permission to take Prague before the Red Army arrived. They knew about his proposal to push the Soviets back to their own borders while American forces were still in position. They knew that Patton, unlike other American commanders, actually meant what he said. Stalin was a man who understood threats. He had eliminated rivals, allies, and friends whenever they became inconvenient. But the Soviets were not the only ones who found Patton troublesome. There were Americans who wanted him quiet too. The State Department was trying to build a post-war relationship with Moscow. The War Department was trying to bring soldiers home. Patton was undermining both efforts with every interview he gave. He had powerful enemies on both sides of what would soon be called the Iron Curtain. The question historians still debate is whether any of them decided to do something about it. December 9th, 1945, a cold Sunday morning near Mannheim, Germany. The day began with unexpected changes. General Patton had planned to spend the day with his close friend General Jeffrey Keyes, who was visiting from 7th Army headquarters. But early that morning, Keyes received an urgent call and had to leave. With his plans suddenly empty, Patton turned to his chief of staff, General Hobart Gay. They decided on the spot to go pheasant hunting instead. This was a last-minute decision. made that very morning. No one outside of Patton's immediate circle knew about it until they were already on the road. Private First Class Horace Woodring, Patton's driver, pulled the 1938 Cadillac staff car onto the highway. The weather was gray and cold, but visibility was adequate. Patton sat in the back seat with Gay, talking about the hunt, about the future, about his plans to return to America for Christmas. Beatrice was waiting for him. They had plans. It was supposed to be a quiet day. At approximately 11:45 in the morning, as the Cadillac approached a railway depot on the outskirts of Mannheim, a 2.5-ton Army truck suddenly turned left directly in front of them. Woodring hit the brakes but could not stop in time. The Cadillac struck the truck at a speed later estimated between 20 and 30 miles per hour. It was not a high-speed collision. It was not the kind of accident that typically kills people. General Gay, sitting right next to Patton, was completely uninjured. Woodring, in the front seat, walked away without a scratch. The truck driver, Technical Sergeant Robert Thompson, was unharmed. But Patton was thrown forward, his head striking something in the car, possibly the partition between compartments, possibly the ceiling, possibly something else entirely. His neck was broken. He was paralyzed from the neck down. The most physically powerful general of the war could no longer move his own body. He was conscious and knew immediately how serious it was. He told Gay that he was afraid he was paralyzed. What happened in the immediate aftermath raises questions that have never been fully answered. Military police arrived at the scene quickly. Thompson, the truck driver, was questioned briefly and released. No charges were filed against him. Within days, Thompson gave an interview to journalist Howard K. Smith, claiming that Patton's driver had been speeding and was at fault. But other witnesses remembered the truck turning suddenly, without warning. The accident scene was not preserved for detailed investigation. No photographs were taken of the vehicle positions. The Cadillac was quickly repaired and returned to service, destroying any forensic evidence it might have contained. For the death of one of America's most famous generals, the investigation was remarkably brief and superficial. Some historians attribute this to the chaos of post-war Germany. Others find it suspicious. The official conclusion was simple. It was a traffic accident, just bad luck. Case closed, except it was not closed in the minds of everyone who knew Patton. Patton was rushed to a military hospital in Heidelberg. The doctors who examined him found severe damage to his cervical spine. He was paralyzed from the neck down, but his condition was stable. Over the following days, he actually showed signs of improvement. He was alert, talking, even joking with nurses. He dictated letters. He complained about being confined to a bed. Beatrice flew from America to be at his side. She read to him and tried to keep his spirits up. The doctors began to cautiously believe that Patton might survive, though he would never walk again. For a man who had lived his entire life in motion, who had commanded tanks and charged into battle, this was a devastating prognosis. But Patton was a fighter. He had survived bullets and shrapnel and a lifetime of combat. He was not ready to surrender to a hospital bed. He told Beatrice he would find a way. He was George Patton. He always found a way. But something about the hospital situation troubled people close to Patton. Security seemed minimal for a 4-star general. People came and went without rigorous identification checks. Patton himself expressed unease to his wife, though he did not elaborate on why. Beatrice took his concerns seriously. She had been married to George for decades. She knew he was not a man who frightened easily. If he sensed something wrong, she believed him. She requested additional security measures. Her requests were acknowledged, but not meaningfully implemented. The medical staff assured her that General Patton was receiving excellent care and that there was nothing to worry about. He was improving. The immediate crisis had passed. All they could do now was wait and hope that his body would heal as much as possible. Beatrice stayed by his side, reading to him, talking to him, watching the door whenever someone entered the room. On December 21st, 1945, 12 days after the accident, George Patton suddenly could not breathe. Despite the efforts of the medical staff, he could not be revived. He was pronounced dead that afternoon. The official cause of death was pulmonary edema and congestive heart failure. He was 60 years old. He had survived 2 world wars, countless battles, and a lifetime of physical risks that would have killed ordinary men many times over. Now he was dead from complications of a car accident at 30 miles per hour. His wife Beatrice made the decision not to request an autopsy. She later explained that she did not want her husband's body subjected to further violation. She wanted him buried with dignity among his soldiers. Patton was laid to rest in the Luxembourg American Cemetery, alongside the men of his beloved Third Army. He had asked to be buried with his troops if he died in Europe. That wish was honored. The questions about his death were buried with him. For a while, for 3 decades, Patton's death remained what the official records said it was: a tragic accident, an unlucky end for a lucky general. Then in 1974, a British novelist named Frederick Nolan published a thriller called The Algonquin Project. The plot centered on an assassination attempt against General Patton. In the novel, an assassin arranges a vehicle accident, and when Patton survives the crash, he is killed in the hospital using a special poison. The method was strikingly specific: a low-velocity projectile, a staged collision, a backup plan involving an untraceable substance. It was fiction. Nolan had no known connection to intelligence agencies. He said he invented the plot based on historical speculation. The book was not a bestseller. It attracted little attention. But 5 years later, it would become the center of one of the strangest confessions in American intelligence history. In September 1979, a former OSS operative named Douglas Bazata stood before an audience of over 400 people at a banquet in Washington, D.C. The event was held at the Hilton Hotel. Many attendees were former intelligence officers. Bazata was not an unknown figure. He had been a decorated agent during the war, conducting sabotage operations behind enemy lines. He had received commendations for bravery. He was considered credible by people who knew him professionally. On that evening, Bazata announced that he had been paid $10,000 by OSS Director William Donovan to kill George Patton. He said he had arranged the accident. He said that when Patton survived the crash, others finished the job in the hospital using a form of cyanide that could cause heart failure. The room fell silent. Some people thought he was joking. He was not joking. He said he had carried this secret for 34 years and could not carry it anymore. Bazata's story was detailed and disturbing. He claimed he had followed Patton's car that morning. He said he had an army truck positioned to collide with the Cadillac. He described a weapon, a low-velocity device that could injure without leaving obvious evidence. He said the plan was not necessarily to kill Patton, but to remove him from public life. When Patton survived and began recovering, Bazata claimed that someone else, a person he would not name, entered the hospital and administered a poison. The substance was supposedly manufactured in Czechoslovakia. It could cause cardiac failure or embolism within 18 to 48 hours and would be virtually undetectable without a specific autopsy looking for it. Since no autopsy was performed, any such substance would have gone to the grave with Patton. It was a perfect crime if it was a crime at all, but there were serious problems with Bazata's account. The most damaging was the timing of his confession. It came 5 years after Nolan's novel described almost exactly the same assassination method. It was later confirmed that Bazata had read the Algonquin Project. He even mentioned it in his personal diary, describing it as partly factual and partly fantasy. Critics immediately asked the obvious question: did Bazata witness history, or did he plagiarize fiction? The similarities were too striking to ignore: a staged accident, a backup poison, a hospital death. Either Frederick Nolan had somehow learned about a real assassination plot and fictionalized it, or Douglas Bazata had read an exciting thriller and decided to claim he was the man who did it. Both explanations seemed equally plausible and equally unprovable. There were other problems with Bazata's credibility. By the late 1970s, according to people who knew him, he was bitter and struggling financially. He felt the intelligence community had betrayed him. He had been promised benefits and recognition that never materialized. He referred to his former colleagues as weaklings, liars, and betrayers. A man in that state of mind might say anything for attention or revenge. Furthermore, his story contained factual errors. He claimed to have known about Patton's travel plans in advance, but the hunting trip was a last-minute decision made only that morning. He claimed to have followed the Cadillac from Bad Nauheim, but the route was improvised. He was vague about crucial details and contradicted himself in different tellings. In his own diary, he wrote that he both did and did not kill Patton. Even his supporters admitted he was conflicted on that essential point. Yet Bazata was not the only person who raised questions about Patton's death. Horace Woodring, Patton's driver, gave interviews decades later expressing doubts about the official account. He remembered the truck appearing suddenly, as if it had been waiting. He remembered details that did not match the accident reports. He never directly accused anyone, but he made clear he did not believe it was a simple accident. Bert Groover, a military intelligence agent in Germany at the time, later claimed he had heard rumors about a plot against Patton even before the accident. Robert Thompson, the truck driver, gave inconsistent statements over the years. He initially said he was alone in the truck, but General Gay reported seeing two men in the cab. These were not definitive testimonies. They were fragments and old memories, but they suggested that something about the official story did not sit right with people who were there. The defenders of the accident theory point out that none of the conspiracy evidence is solid. Bazata was unreliable. The other witnesses were speaking decades after the fact. There is no documentary proof of any assassination order. The accident happened in chaotic post-war Germany, where traffic incidents were common and investigations were often cursory. Patton's injuries, while unusual, were medically plausible. A man thrown forward in a car could strike his head and break his neck without any foul play. His death from cardiac complications 12 days later was tragic, but not medically suspicious for someone with severe spinal trauma. The lack of autopsy, while unusual for a general, was Beatrice's choice, not a cover-up. Sometimes accidents are just accidents. Sometimes luck simply runs out, even for the luckiest men. But the questions persist because the circumstances were so strange. Patton was one of the most famous and controversial men in the world. He had powerful enemies on multiple continents. He died in a minor accident that injured no one else. He was improving in the hospital and then suddenly was not. No autopsy was performed. No serious investigation was conducted. The man who might have answered some questions, Douglas Bazata, gave a dramatic confession and then muddied it with contradictions. And a novelist, years before that confession, wrote a story that matched the conspiracy theory almost exactly. The coincidences pile up without resolving into proof. They sit in history like an unsolved equation, tantalizing and frustrating anyone who tries to find the answer. What would have happened if Patton had lived? He told friends he planned to resign from the Army and return to America. He wanted to write his memoirs. He wanted to tell the truth about the war and the peace. He wanted to speak out against policies he believed were surrendering Eastern Europe to Soviet tyranny. Would anyone have listened? Patton was a celebrity, one of the most famous soldiers in American history. When he spoke, people paid attention. If he had returned home and launched a public campaign against the Soviet alliance, he might have changed the political conversation. He might have strengthened the voices, calling for confrontation years before that became mainstream policy. Or he might have been dismissed as a warmonger and forgotten. History does not reveal its alternatives. We only know that Patton never got the chance to find out. George Patton died in a hospital bed in Heidelberg on December 21st, 1945. He was buried in Luxembourg among his soldiers. His warnings about the Soviet Union proved accurate within years. The Cold War, he predicted, lasted decades. The Iron Curtain fell exactly where he said it would. Douglas Bazata died in 1999, still claiming he knew the truth about what happened. Frederick Nolan's novel remains in print, a strange footnote to a strange story. And the questions remain, unanswered, and perhaps unanswerable. Was Patton murdered? Was he the victim of an accident? Did a novelist guess the truth, or did a bitter old spy copy a thriller? The evidence points in all directions, and none. What we know for certain is this: George Patton lived loudly and died quietly, and his last words to his wife were as direct as everything else he ever said. This is a hell of a way to die. He was right about that. He was right about most things. That was always his problem. A novel published in 1974, a confession in 1979, a death in 1945 that still has no clear answer. Bazata said he did it. Then he said he did not. The driver remembered things that did not match the reports, and Patton himself told his wife he felt unsafe in that hospital. What do you believe? Accident or assassination? Tell me in the comments. And if you want more stories that history tried to bury, subscribe now. The truth is always stranger than fiction. Sometimes fiction is stranger than truth.